Hey y'all, I am so excited to be back with a new episode. It's Women's History Month, so no better time to be getting back into the swing of things. The episode this week has quite literally been months in the making. I am talking to Kenzie New Walker today. Kenzie New Walker is the executive director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. And we actually had a plan where I was supposed to go to the Mine Wars Museum, do some in-person stuff, go on a tour. Unfortunately, winter in Appalachia is so real. I'm sure we're all feeling it right now. Finally, the sun is coming out and the snow is thawing off, but that did prevent this episode from happening for quite a long time. Winter is truly for hibernation, and I'm trying to remind myself of that. But I'm so excited about this episode today. Kenzie is maybe one of the most knowledgeable people about the Mine Wars I've ever had the chance to talk to. I could talk to her all day. I was learning so much during the recording of this podcast that at points where I was like pausing and being like, oh yeah, I'm doing an interview. So I hope that you all get a lot out of this. We talk specifically about women that were doing the things during the Mine Wars. You know, we think a lot about the men and the march, but women were there, of course, and they had a role to play. And, you know, during this interview, we talk about what we do know, and then we talk a lot about what we don't know. And that actually is quite a lot. But as you'll hear in this episode, the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum is not only a museum, but they also have an archive, and they want to hear stories from people that have connection to the West Virginia Mine Wars. So I'm really excited to share this interview with all of you. And as you know, the goal always is, I hope that you learn something new. I hope you learn about women that you've never heard of before. It's International Women's Month. It's always International Women's Month at this podcast, but March is International Women's Month. Yeah, without further ado, here's my interview with Kenzie New Walker. Long time no talk because I've been on pause on this podcast, but I'm really excited that my first guest in 2026 is Kenzie New Walker. Kenzie is the executive director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. And Kenzie, I would love if you would introduce yourself a little bit more with some background and maybe talk a little bit about what the Mine Wars Museum, their mission, and what they're all about.
Jessica, thanks for having me. I'm so glad that this is finally happening and always happy to talk about the mine wars and especially women in the mine wars. I'm Kenzie and I have been running the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum since 2018. So I've been in this role for a little over 7 years, which is hard to believe sometimes. I grew up in the coal fields of southern West Virginia. I'm the daughter, granddaughter, and great granddaughter of union coal miners, and I am very, very proud of that. Also, daughter and granddaughter of public school teachers, union public school teachers. Also, very proud of that. So, education and the legacy of the mine wars really feels like it's just quite literally in my blood and DNA. The West Virginia Mine Wars Museum is located in Matewan, West Virginia. So we sit right on the border of southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. And I think most listeners probably have heard of Matewan through the movie. There was this 1987 film that was published that really put Matewan on the map for a national audience. But I feel like if you grow up in Appalachia and you grow up around stories of labor or in union households, Matewan is also very much talked about. The museum is pretty, it's still fairly young. I mean, we celebrated 10 years last year as an institution. We were really formed a little bit before that. There was a protest march in 2011 to save Blair Mountain from mountaintop removal. And some of the activists got together after that march and said, there's really not a place where people can come to learn about the mine wars and the largest armed labor uprising in the history of our country, which felt pretty bizarre. So they looked at Matewan as a place that had been embracing this history, unlike any of the other mine wars towns. When we look at the mine wars, we're looking at all of southern West Virginia from a period of 1900s until the 1920s, early 1900s to the 1920s. Matewan is this town that stood up against the mine guard system and the mine guard rule, which we can talk a little bit about that later. And it's also home to this local union, UMWA Local 1440, who was really interested in having the museum there. So we were founded 10 years ago, opened up the doors, and we have this mission to preserve and educate. We tell the story about life in the coal camps. We talk about the Pink Creek Cabin Creek strikes. We talk about how Mingo County got the moniker Bloody Mingo and the Battle of Matewan that happened. We talk about, of course, Blair Mountain and the treats and trials that followed. And we really work to keep the memory and legacy alive. And we do that through a number of programs. Education is one of them, including things like being on this podcast and telling stories, but we're also in classrooms and we're building monuments and we have an archives. We're doing all the things it feels like these days. And we're really proud to do it. We say we're a people's history museum because we're not shy that, hey, we tell these stories from the perspectives of working people, miners and their families. And, the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum is unique in the fact that it is a people's history museum. There's not a lot of those across the country. And we're one of the only independent institutions that I know of that has had this like really unique relationship with organized labor from day one. And we've really put our money where our mouth is. Just last month, we unionized with the United Mine Workers, and so we're stoked about that. But yeah, we also run in Matewan the Cecily Roberts Building, which is like a huge, quite literally a huge building downtown. It's 11,000 square feet. It was the Matewan National Bank. It's kind of weird to think about Matewan being large enough to have a national bank. And yeah, we have a community center in that building. We just launched an Airbnb. We've been busy. We were talking about that before the podcast. We've had a busy winter and we've had a busy couple years. But that's a little bit about the museum and where we came from and what we've been up to.
That's awesome. Congratulations on unionizing.
Thank you. Thank you.
I myself am a union worker as well. Search Workers Union, shout out. It's fascinating to me because I think this is a testament to like how much work you guys have done. Is I would have thought that the Mine Wars Museum was much older than 10 years. Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, I came into this interview and I was like, I'm just going to let Kenzie give me the information because it's like through osmosis, we grow up and we learn a lot. But like, I didn't look up Mine Wars Museum specifically. So when you said you were 10 years old, I was like, whoa, that's super young for a nonprofit, an organization, a museum to sort of have the reach that you already have. Like, that's really, really impressive.
That's
So,
great to hear. Yes.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. And also, like, I can't imagine a Mine Wars museum being anywhere other than Matewan. So when you were like, the union really wanted the museum to be in Matewan, I'm like, yeah, that
Yeah.
I can't. I feel like if it were anywhere else, maybe other than Harlan, uh, people would be a little upset about that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And one thing that I'll say, the museum has started to grow beyond the walls of Matewan. I think I mentioned that we're putting up monuments. So one of the things that we're trying to do is build what we think might become the country's largest labor history trail that's drivable. And so we're going to have sites uh, from Charleston to Matewan to start. We're basically following in the footsteps of the Redneck Army, so coal miners who march, and we're going to start to illuminate some of those sites, and people will be able to like hear the story as they travel from Charleston to Matewan and stop in communities and figure out what was happening in Madison or what was happening in Marmet, which is the site where Mother Jones brought that fake telegram to try to stop the march. So, and we put up a monument of Mother Jones in Marmet a couple of years ago. So we're building on that process. Anybody that's interested, Google Courage in the Hollers, and you'll find out more about what we're up to. And we just hired a coordinator for that project, and y'all are going to be hearing about that a lot. So yeah, we're stoked.
That's really awesome and super exciting, and I can't wait to see how that expands. And for anyone that hasn't listened to the Mother Jones episode, we'll touch on Mother Jones a little bit in this episode, but I do encourage you to go back and listen to that with Stacey Fugit, because we talk about that. Her saying, "I've got a telegram," and everybody's like, "Let me see it,"
Yeah,
and she's like, no." That's my
that
Mother Jones
is
impression.
exactly how it happened.
Yes.
You gotta throw an Irish accent on
Yeah,
there
yeah.
though.
Well, I'm not gonna embarrass myself. I do have like Irish ancestry, because I mean, at this point, I don't know anybody that doesn't personally, but in this area. But yeah, I won't embarrass myself with that. So close to St. Patrick's Day. But so you touched on Mother Jones a little bit. Also, I feel like most of my audience knows the origins of the word redneck, but part of me is like, maybe we should touch on that, just sort of where that terminology comes from, and how the term redneck really relates to the Mine Wars and is not a slur. I don't consider it a slur, I should say. Because, it's been this word that like we're demeaning people that, are perceived to be like uneducated or from Appalachia, and I have never felt that way. We had people like Gretchen Wilson reclaim redneck woman. but no,
Yeah,
seriously, the meaning or the origin of redneck is much deeper.
I mean, part of how I think about the museum's work is reclamation. And one of our founders, Chuck Keeney, had came up with a term, identity reclamation, which is what I think we're doing at the museum. And so reclaiming the word redneck is definitely part of that. The term wasn't there's precursors to when how we've used that term in the past. I've heard it be referred to as farmers. In the South, they would be called rednecks because they get sunburn on their neck. But when we're talking about redneck in this podcast, in the context of the Mine Wars, people should know that in 1921, after decades of abuse, 10,000 coal miners and their families banded together across race, gender, ethnicity, and they took up arms and they marched for 50 miles from Charleston, the state of West Virginia's capital, determined to get to Mingo County. They were going to free some coal miners who had been jailed there without due process. So this is a battle, quite literally, for constitutional rights. When we think about the mine wars, and the coal miners would never reach Mingo. They clashed with coal company deputies, mine guards, state police, and militia in 5.5 days of combat in Logan County on Blair Mountain. Blair Mountain is a twin peak ridge in Logan County. And many of these coal miners had a uniform. They wore, some of them actually wore World War I uniforms. Many of them were veterans. And some wore like blue jean overalls that became like known as um, that was something else that you would see like a coal miner have on. All of them, most of them had red bandanas tied on their persons, either around their necks, around their arms. And this helped them identify each other in battle. This was a battle tactic to for them to be able to see. And there's a lot of lore about where these red handkerchiefs would come from. Um, but they became known as the Redneck Army. And so we can look at some of the historical documents and you'll see like the Logan County Sheriff quoted, kill all the rednecks you can. And so this was like used, this term became used against people, and this history was buried for a long time for a couple reasons. One is it was straight state censorship. When folks come to the museum, and I hope that you do if you're listening, we're getting ready to open for our 11th season. Um, we have an exhibit in the memory and legacy section of the Mine Wars where you can basically take a look from the 1930s. Our governor says leave out any mention of Mother Jones or the Miners' March explicitly. You can read a letter that he wrote to a historian who was writing the state history of West Virginia and said, hey, leave this out. So we see censorship starting just right after these events took place. And so that would continue. There wasn't a mention of the Battle of Blair Mountain for 50 years in a state history text. Let's think about that. The other reason why this wasn't talked about is coal miners were put on trial for treason after the Battle of Blair Mountain. This was treason against the state of West Virginia. Um, and some of the other charges included murder or conspiracy to commit murder. And more than 500 were taken into the court. So we see the battle switch from the battlefield to the courtroom. And so people aren't going to talk about this publicly as these charges are being put forth. So, like, one of the unfortunate things from this story is that there's a lot of pieces that I think are lost because people didn't talk about it. They're just lost forever. That's why I think, like, sitting down and telling your stories are so important for just record keeping, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today for women is based on oral testimony, things that we've been able to pull together from our archives, and from various sources. But yeah, this was a history not taught in classrooms, not taught in public. And so that's why the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum comes on the scene 90 some years after the Battle of Blair Mountain. And I feel like a lot of people, when you talk about the mine wars, it's more popularly known these days. Whereas 10 years ago, if you ask somebody about the Battle of Blair Mountain, they'd be like, what? I haven't heard about this. So I feel like we've made really large strides in putting this back into popular conscious, especially for us, for Appalachians to know about. So yeah, that's where the term redneck comes from. That's what we mean when we're referring to the mine wars.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. You know, I went through the Kentucky public school system, and I remember just learning things in college and then afterwards, just like so much history about this place that was not taught to me in schools, was not something that had to be taught to me in schools. And it is interesting, just like this resurgence of, I mean, that's the reason this podcast exists, right? Is because I'm like, people need to know about these amazing women in our history that have done so many badass things. And like this region being at the forefront of the labor movement, of social movements, you know, environmental movements, name it, etc. Specifically the women though. So I really want to,
Yes.
I really want to get into that. Mother Jones definitely the most well known, you know, figure of the Mon Wars. icon, legend. What is there that needs to be said that hasn't been said already about Mother Jones?
Yeah, what a force. And she's the most documented. Like we know about her because one, like listening to the podcast about Mother Jones, if others have listened to it, she wrote her own autobiography. So like I feel like she might have had she had resources to be able to do this, and two, she was probably thinking about like the legacy that she was leaving and who was going to pick up that torch. And yeah, she's just like an incredible figure. And like I grew up hearing from my dad who said, "Oh, your Papa Forrest would sing songs about Mother Jones." Like she's just like such a towering figure when you think about the Mind Wars. Like she's up there with the Bill Blizzards and the Frank Keys and the Fred Moonies. Like I love that she's hand in hand
Right.
with
And
all those organizers.
yeah. And also, I just want to note like an immigrant. I feel like that's important to note. An Irish immigrant. Um, I mean, most of, if you look back, I can't say this for certain, but I think anecdotally, if you think about who the miners were at this time, most of them were first or second generation immigrants. Um, I would be
One,
interested to know the actual statistic there.
yeah, I could probably pull this. I don't have it in front of me, but I do know that this was a strategy that coal operators used. There's a coal operator who was quoted speaking at a conference to other coal operators. They get together and talk about business and whatever. And so Justice Collins said that they should strive for a judicious mixture of people to work in their coal mines. Because like when we think about, and this might be getting too deep into the weeds, but when we think about what happened in Central Appalachia, ain't the first time that land was stolen here, but land was bought up and it became privately owned. That wasn't how things were being done here historically. People were working and farming to their own land. They needed a new labor force, and it was a tactic to go up to Ellis Island to recruit European immigrants who were just getting off the boat. And these co-operators said, "Look, we've got the American dream down in southern West Virginia or central Appalachia." They put them on a train to come down, and those immigrants would be indebted to the coal company for that train ride. So the way in which the company town operated was very much put a lot of coal miners in debt to this company store. Same thing was true for recruitment of workers in the Deep South, former sharecroppers. They would also go down there, and comparatively speaking to sharecroppers working in a coal mine in West Virginia looked like a pretty good deal. And so again, they would come in. When we're talking about this time period, this is very diverse in coal camps. And it contributes, I think, to like just the rich Appalachian culture that we know and have today. Now, of course, like they were segregated in coal camps, but underground they worked side by side. And if anybody knows anything about coal mining, especially then, it was backbreaking labor. So solidarity was built through class. I think that's very important. That's a lesson that we can take today when we're seeing about just this disproportionate wealth inequality that's happening in this country. Appalachians have led the way before, and it was built through class solidarity. And then just one other note, the UMWA used to publish their journal in 27 different languages, just to give you a sense of like what a coal camp might have sounded like back in the day. It was not just English being spoken.
I remember hearing that UMWA fact before and thinking to myself, there nobody in Floyd County when I was growing up, there's no way there's 27 different languages. You know, it's just like how much this area has changed over, 100 years. But yeah,
Yeah.
I love hearing that. And like people talk about like, oh, I remember the boom. I remember when this was a boom town, and they talk about it like it's New York City. Um, which when you think about it, like at one point, Pike County, Kentucky was the richest county in the country.
Crazy to think about.
In the country had a airport just for those private jets flying in. Like I think about that all the time. My dad's from Pike County, and yeah, so I'm just like, you know, to think about that, to think about Appalachia as a place like that is really hard, I think, for a lot of us to wrap our minds around that the people, our ages that grew up here and live here. Who are
Yeah.
some other key figures besides Mother Jones that maybe people haven't heard about before?
The first one um, that I think is really interesting is a woman by the name of Sarah Blizzard. She was also, by the way, known colloquially as Mother Blizzard or Ma Blizzard. So thinking about how using that name in terms of like how we think about folks in our community, like she was another endearing figure in this period and like a key organizer. Her and Mother Jones, from what I can tell, were pretty tight. Like they were hanging out after the rallies and the speeches. So like these gals were friends. So these were gals that were hanging out, and Mother Blizzard, um, we she's often referred to as Rebecca. So like if folks are like, I want to learn more about this person, you might see her name as Rebecca. From what we know, she was likely born around 1864. So like Mother Jones at the time of the Mine Wars, Ma Blizzard would have been older at this point. We know that Ma Blizzard was married to Timothy Blizzard, who was a man from a Nicholas County farming family who had been a member of the Knights of Labor even before the UMWA was formed in 1890. So this is a very labor conscious family that before the mine wars even got started. Ma Blizzard and her husband, they had 6 children, the most famous of whom was Bill Blizzard. So for folks that are like deep in the weeds of Mine Wars history, Bill Blizzard was like the general of the Redneck Army. We see him referred to. So he helps lead the miners during the Battle of Blair Mountain. Basically, how she enters the story, um, they were evicted from one of their homes in Fayette County. So when we think about the mine wars, I know a lot of people will start to pick up during the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strikes in 1913, roughly to 1915. But there was actually some mine wars that occurred in the early 1900s in Fayette County, which is where they were living at that time. And they were evicted from their coal camp house in Fayette County during the New River strike of 1902. So basically, what would happen is that coal miners and their families lived in company housing as sort of a condition of their employment. Um, when they decided to join the union, not only did they become jobless, they also became houseless. And so we start to see these evictions take place. It's like a telltale feature of the mine wars and a feature of the story. So they end up um, settling in what is known as the free town of Eskdale. Eskdale is in Kanawha County. So this gets the Blizzards to um, the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike area. Similar to like Matewan. Matewan was not a company town that was ran and owned by coal companies. It was considered a free town. So this gives them a base of operations, and the Blizzards, and particularly Ma, ran a store and a restaurant in Estelle known as Ma Blizzard's Place. It became a place where, people like Mother Jones, there's stories of Mother Jones staying at Ma Blizzard's Place. It's where miners would come and hang out. So, in order to talk about Ma Blizzard, I want to just like back up and talk a little bit about the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strikes and sort of set the scene for what was going on. Why did she enter in the first place? So, in April of 1912, we see the UMWA making a huge unionization push where 12,000 miners along the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek district walked out on strike. Basically, the demands were this. They wanted to restore the miners' right to free speech and peaceable assembly, constitutional rights, basic in the First Amendment of the Constitution. This is what they're asking for. They want to end compulsory trading at the company store. A lot of miners were, back in this day, you got paid by the ton, and they were getting shorted oftentimes. So they had check weighmen that would basically weigh their cart of coal. And oftentimes they'd say, you've got too much rock and slate in this. We're going to short you. So they wanted to install scales at all the mines, and they wanted to remove all mine guards, and they wanted to allow the miners to hire a check weighman to make sure that the coal was being properly weighed. One thing that I think is interesting when we think about this story is predominantly miners are not asking for better pay or better hours. They're asking for like being treated fairly and justly. What ends up happening is that coal operators responded by importing 300 mine guards and evicting all striking miners from their homes. And so miners and their families hauled their belongings across the creeks, and they established tent colonies at Eskdale on Cabin Creek. This is where Ma Blizzard is. This is where her home is, as well as Holly Grove on Paint Creek. So again, tent colonies. If you Google the mine wars, you'll see these tent colonies. These were basically communities that popped up all across southern West Virginia, and women played a huge part in both keeping the household running and also keeping the tent colonies running. I think like a couple of things that happened for Ma Blizzard to rise up as like this militant matriarch of the mine wars. One is we see her tearing up tracks during the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike. Often companies would respond by bringing in scab labor to keep production going. This is a tactic that is like still used today. It's the oldest trick in the book to pit workers against workers. We have a great exhibit in the museum that has some tools that might have been employed by women, and it's inspired by the story of Ma Blizzard. They take a group of women, she takes a group of women to use crowbars to tear up the C&O railroad tracks. So they are quite literally in their gowns with these huge tools tearing up the tracks to one, make sure that they can't haul in scab labor, and two, to prevent coal from being ran at all. You didn't, if they couldn't sell the coal, what good was it? And so this is a great example of, I think, women saying this is how we're gonna contribute to the movement. Like they're not just miners' wives. No, they had an active part to play in this story.
I love that her first action is like, we're just gonna cut them off. We're cutting it
Yeah.
off. And she just like, what's so interesting is that, well, number one, you know, they evict all these miners who they're upset with, and then they go and they're living like near Ma. And to think about that, it's like right time, right place energy. Cause she, you know, she had to be like, oh, okay, well, we gotta do some shit to to get this straightened out. And yeah, I just love that. It made me think about, and I was about to Google it to get the year right, but the movement in Harlan County in, I think it was 2018, 2019. I'm not sure, but the black jewel miners blocking the railroad. So
Yes,
they couldn't take the coal out because they weren't getting paid because, the tactic of, well, the company's actually bankrupt and we can't pay you. But meanwhile, that tactic is like, meanwhile, they're making another LLC, and it's going to be a different company now. And it's just so funny to me, like, however many years later, we're still going back to, okay, well, we're gonna mess up the railroad. We're gonna like block you from hauling coal, bringing people in, whatever we got to do. It's almost like it feels like a DNA type thing, you know?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I remember that story because I had just started working at the museum right around that time. So it felt like similar to the ed strikes and the teacher strikes. I was like, yes, this is like a direct line to what we've learned from the mine wars. Even if it's not talked about in that way in that moment, I think like, yeah, it's something that we inherently know. And I think too, there's stories of women um, who would also harass the strike breakers, with pots and pans and like weapons to say, hey, get out of here. We're on strike right now. And I think I'm thinking back to Harlan County, USA documentary and seeing how women held the line. They participated in the picket lines and direct action strikes, and the same thing was true during the period of the mine wars. Even if we don't have the specifics of it, we know that these stories exist and people are continuing to carry that legacy forward, especially women.
So with Maul's story, that she collects these women, they go out and they decide to rip up the tracks. What happens next? Like, what is the next step from the company, from them, from maybe the miners that have been evicted? What happens next?
Typically, they would have laid new line down to continue running. I mean, when we think about the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, this was going on for like 15 months. This was a long strike, and people were living out in all conditions of Appalachia through the winter. I mean, we've seen what kind of winter we've had this year in the year 2026. So conditions weren't great. And there was a lot of, I actually pulled some testimony from women. One of the things that happened after the Paint Creek Crab Creek strike was there was a Senate investigation for what the hell's going on in West Virginia, basically, what is happening in the coal fields. Um, and I think too, like one of the things that prompted this investigation was like the stories of violence, particularly that centered around the railroad by company guards, mine guards, fallen felt agents, and people who were in that camp. So one of the most notable acts of violence that happened was um, they mine guards had um, brought in this armored train that was known as the Bull Move Special, and um, they took a Gatling gun and peppered the tent colony in Holly Grove, basically firing shots, numbers, lots of rounds into the tent colony. And remarkably, only one person was killed during that incident, and that was because railroad tracks are often built up on elevation. And at that time, machine guns didn't have the ability to move down or up. They could only move side to side. So they were just like basically firing as many rounds as they could into this tent colony. Um, and we get to hear testimony from a woman named Maud Easted, who was the wife of the miner who was killed, also an Italian immigrant. And she was pregnant at this time, and she testified in these Senate hearings that um, her husband, Francis Sesko, he's known most notably as Sesko Estep, was shot in the face and killed while he was trying to usher her and their toddler into a cellar for safety. Um, and so this comes from the testimony that was captured during this 1913 United States Senate investigation into the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike. And some of the testimony is pretty brutal, but I think it's important because, one, we get to read from the perspective of women through this testimony, which is not something that, especially at this time, was often reported in the archives. Something we're constantly battling just as an institution is like, how do we fill some of these archival silences? And the way that we do that is just by like talking to people. Um, and I pulled a couple other testimonies. Um, One's from a woman named Maud Fish, who we don't know a ton about, um, but she testified that in July 1912, while she was at a train station, she was grabbed by the throat and struck several times by a guard named Bill Falk for attempting to warn incoming strike breakers about the strike. So women would often, like, I think, try to advocate and say, hey, there's a strike happening here. Sometimes workers were just brought in unknowingly what they were coming into. Um, and we heard again from Gianna Sevilla, who um, talked about her experience in the tent colony. And she references an incident on June 5th, 1912. And she said that about 20 Baldwin Phelps guards entered her cabin and they were looking for her husband. And when she asked them to leave her sleeping baby alone, two guards struck her and kicked her in the stomach. And she was 5 months pregnant at the time, and her baby was born dead 2 months later. And this was detailed in Dave Corbin's anthology, Gun Thugs, Rednecks, and Radicals. So I think on the flip side of this, like one thing that is always difficult to think about is like these are stories of tragedy that women are having to talk about in the state's capital. Like they're brought there to discuss this. And even though these are like direct reports of what we have, I I don't want to like focus too much on women necessarily being victims in this story because I think oftentimes this shows one their resilience and also just like how brutal it actually was in the tent colony.
This has my mind like just thinking about current events, you know, violence against immigrants that we've seen, um, and how this has just like been a repeated pattern over the nation's history. That I think this is a whole other podcast and a whole other discussion. But just thinking about, we know ICE activity is happening in West Virginia right now. Uh, I've heard like multiple things about what people think are happening. Like, is West Virginia the training ground for ICE right now? I feel like there's some organizers that believe that sort of thing because nobody's really watching what's happening in West Virginia more at a national scale. So these things can just kind of like go under the radar. But I do think it's important, what you said, like it's good to not focus on these tragic stories. And it also feels like there's just so much, because there's not this good documentation of what these women in the camps were experiencing, what they were doing, how they were fighting back, that sort of thing. It just makes me think about all the lost stories that are there that we won't have like specific details, things like that. Um, yeah, and how that's also happening right now.
Yeah, I think that's an important I think that's an important lesson. One, and I also think it's like fair to compare it to what's happening today, and like um, thinking about private police, which were Baldwin Phelps guards. They were unidentified. You know what I mean? Secret agents um, coming in and causing terror on working class families. This has happened before. Um, and yeah, I think like when we think about how women have contributed to the movements and to the mind wars, I think part of that is passing stories down in their like within families. I think about that often with um, in my own family, for instance, like my great grandfather's. There's basically like a couple old Tide boxes, like that you keep detergent in, that all his Union stuff are in those boxes and like preserved. And that was the result of my mom saying, hey, like, let's keep those. I want to keep those. I want to be able to have those. And thinking about women as like history keepers and passing the word, basically, even though that stays within the family, that's a way, a record of keeping memories alive. And there's some great, I think some of the best stories about the mine wars or the best documentation that we have about the mine wars have also come from women. Now that we're sitting down to think about it, Anne Lawrence, who is a young woman in the 1970s, did did a lot of research and did this great oral history project on dark and bloody ground. And she recorded stories with everyone from all sides of this story. She recorded coal miners' wives. She recorded people who um, were in Don Chafin's army, based the other side, the people who established lines in Logan County. And I think about Jesse Wilkerson, you know, who wrote "To Live Here, You Have to Fight," and the great women activists in her story. She's also, I think, when her book Next Research Project comes out, I know she's doing lots of research on Mob Blizzard, like trying to put together more stories of women. And when we think about Mob Blizzard, just to like tie it back to that legacy, forgot to mention this earlier. Her great grandson, or it might be her grandson, is Cecil Roberts, who was president of the UMWA for like 30 plus years. I think he's the second longest running president after John L. Lewis. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. Um,
That is like the funnest fact of fun facts, to be honest.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what a legacy, you know, to have and be a part of. Um, yeah.
That's awesome. That's amazing. I also want to mention the book Storming Heaven, fiction book.
Yes,
I
yes.
cannot remember the author.
Denise
Denise.
Giardina.
Yes. One of the best books ever, in my opinion. I love that book so much. Like, if someone were to ask me, what's your favorite book about Appalachia? I think that would definitely be up there. Um,
It's on the top of my list too.
yeah, it is so good, written so smartly. Oh, like this make me just talking about it makes me want to reread it. If you've never read it and you're listening to this, like you have to read it. You have to this year make it your goal to read that book. Um, yeah, and it goes in, I mean, it's about the Mountain Wars, and it's just a fictionalized version, but so also so accurate, like very very good storytelling.
Yeah. No, I agree. When people ask me for recommendations inside the museum, I always pick up that book and hand it to them and just like, yeah, another book by a female author. of Appalachia that is like, um, you know, telling our story and passing the word. I think that's super, yeah, super important. And Denise, she came to the museum last year or the year before, so we'll do book talks, and she came and spoke about what that was like. I mean, that book was published in the late 80s, I think, when no one was talking about this history. So she was really like a pioneer in terms of how we pull these stories together. She's so badass. Um,
That's awesome. It also makes me think about like the women who hopefully one day I'll have an actual episode dedicated to these women, but like thinking about Florence Reese and how these stories are passed down in music, and you're talking about oral history and just artifacts and things like that. It's it's an Appalachian tradition of like we're very bad at documenting our stuff, but we have a very rich like oral history that we do pass down, which I appreciate, and at the same time, as someone who does document things and understands the reason that they should be documented, I find it frustrating sometimes when people are like, "No, oral history is about it not being recorded," that sort of thing. But yeah, I I just think about all the women and the role that they've played in keeping all of these stories and these just the movement alive.
I ditto to all of that. And also, like you bringing up Denise's book had me thinking about the character Nurse Carrie in that book. So, like, for folks who are not familiar with Storming Heaven, it's told in four different voices, right? It's been a few years since I've picked it up. I'm also like, I should pick that up again and read it. Um, but Nurse Carrie is one of those voices, and like when we think about how are women contributing to the labor movement, one of the ways that they did in the mine wars, and even today, they're caregivers. Um, and Nurse Carrie is based on something super real. So I'm showing Jessica a picture of women miners during the battle of, or women nurses during the Battle of Blair Mountain. Women were like on the battlefield during the Battle of Blair Mountain. And so when I spoke earlier about some of the men had some of the coal miners had participated in World War I, and I think that's true for some of these women too. They were on the front lines in World War I or serving on the Western Front. They wouldn't have technically, I guess, been on the front lines, but they volunteered um, during the Battle of Blair Mountain and set up basically like makeshift field hospitals in the wilderness. And they had Red Crosses. Basically, this was like during the time when Red Cross was getting set up and were training women. But the quote on this photo says that this shows a group of the nurses who accompanied the army of armed miners that marched into Mingo County, West Virginia coal fields in protest against the conditions there. The army is 5,000 strong. And so if we look closely, the women, and we have a teaching trunk. If there's any educators listening out there, we have a teaching trunk that shows a cap. On their caps, they would have had UMW stitched to basically indicate, like, hey, we're on the side of the United Mine Workers. And there was a couple. There's another photo, and I'll send this one to you, Jessica, to share. There's another photo of a woman named Isabella Riggs who ran a hotel in Blair that she was contracted by the United Mine Workers to feed the Redneck Army. And there's this photo of her basically with a machete. It looks like peeling potatoes over like a skillet. And so when we think about how women showed up, they were helping with supplies. There's stories of women smuggling weapons underneath their garments and their dress in order to get it to where it needed to go, basically. And I feel like it's unfortunate that we only know like tidbits. Like I can't tell you any more about Isabella Riggs, or I can't tell you about if a woman a specific woman who was one of these nurses. I just know that they existed. And right now that's what we do know. But I think like the more that we're doing swapping stories like this, and the longer the museum's around, I hope that we can like take up more of those stories, or people start to do more digging and saying, well, I learned that my great grandmother was actually one of those nurses. Like that would be so cool to have.
Yeah, I love that. And it's good to know that like the museum is open to like if you have a story about one of your family members.
Please. Yeah,
Yes.
we know that stories are missing. There's two other women that I wanted to mention,
Yeah.
specific specific to Blair Mountain, and just the way that women are showing up during the Battle of Blair Mountain. So one of the ways that women participated were as reporters. This was pretty rare at this time. But we do know that some of these stories exist. There's a woman named Mildred Morris who was a journalist with the International News Service. And apparently, she was with three other journalists reporting on the Miners' March and the Battle of Blair Mountain. Important to know, and you would get this when you come to the museum, these stories were national news. Like they were being published about in the New York Times. People like were aware at this time that this was happening, and there was guerrilla warfare raging in the mountains. Apparently, Mildred was fired upon by state police and company allied gunmen, and she was taken back to Logan by Don Chafin and was held captive there it used to be the Aracoma Hotel. That was like the headquarters at the time. That hotel doesn't exist anymore. But you can go to where it is, and we got a future monument going to that site. Um, and she was struck by a bullet, so she was like held captive there. And her story, I think, is really interesting. And there's another story about women serving as reporters during the Pike Creek and Cabin Creek strikes. Cora Older, who was a journalist from San Francisco, who interviewed Mother Jones after her arrest and wrote two articles on the court martial in Pratt. And this Cora had campaigned for Jones's release, so she was being held under martial law in Pratt. And people can, I was part of a small group that got a marker that, if you listen to the Mother Jones podcast, you'll know that building where she was held, not necessarily building, it was a house where she was held in jail, that was torn down, unfortunately. But there's a marker there that shows like, hey, this is where Mother Jones would have been held. Um, so she had campaigned for her release and for a congressional inquiry into the West Virginia National Guard's violations of constitutional rights to a jury trial. And I think that's another cool way in which women are like contributing to the story, and we can point to like concrete evidence that the people and women outside of the region were also paying attention to what was happening.
This again brings up another woman who is from outside the region, Barbara Koppel, who read about what was happening in Harlan County and then made Harlan County, USA. Like she came down and made an Oscar-winning documentary about a strike and a fight for a union contract. And yeah, it's just fascinating how these things are just, it's like a pattern or something.
Yeah.
Or yeah.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. I could talk to you all day about the Mom Wars, but I am going to be like cognizant of time. I do want to, so you mentioned like several of the projects you have that you're working on, monuments, that sort of thing. I'm very excited about the Solidarity project. Uh,
Yeah.
and I would love if you would talk a little bit more about that.
Sasa Will, who is a wonderful artist based in Huntington. He's working on a mural called Solidarity. And Sasa was like, hey, at what level would you like to be involved? And we were like, we would love to be involved at any level. So Sasa is putting together this like life-size mural that features characters of the Mine Wars. And he's doing so through a process called polytab. And Sasa would be able to explain this better than I can. However, polytab is a way in which people can participate in a mural in like segments and pieces, and those pieces become part of this like really beautiful quilted design up on the wall. And so throughout the year, we're inviting folks to come and participate in this mural. There's a couple different ways to get involved. If you are an educator in Eastern Kentucky or Southern West Virginia, holler at the museum. We would love to have y'all for a tour. And then we'll invite SASA down. Y'all can go upstairs in the community center and participate. So we're very interested in grounding this in education, but also having people from these areas and people who have stories to share to come and participate in. The mural should be completed by the end of the year or beginning of next year. So it's going to be like a year-long process. And of course, Mother Jones is like the first figure that's going up on this mural. So yeah, the solidarity. This is one of what I hope to be many murals that will be scattered throughout the region that's representative of this like rad labor history that we have. And again, I think it's like a beautiful act of reclamation. It's taking like a bare wall and putting not only wonderful art up on it, but also people with really powerful stories. And I think um, people that we as Appalachians can look up to, Appalachian women we can look up to, and just people's heroes, basically, people that we don't hear about in the classroom or didn't hear about in the classroom. So, yeah, super cool project. We're honored to be a part of it. And yeah, I can't wait to see what Sasa cooks up.
That's so awesome. I've participated in a community mural before. This was in Southwest Virginia, not in West Virginia, but it's so much fun, and I recommend everyone do it because it's really cool. Also to like drive by that mural and know that I did that little section of that mural. Yeah, and I love a community art project as an artist and community organizer, and yeah. So, also, you mentioned that you're about to open for your 11th season. When do you open? Like, what are your operating hours for folks that do want to come out and visit the museum?
So the museum operates on like this touristy schedule. We're open year round by appointment. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I'm going through Matewan in December, like send us an email. We might be able to make it happen. But anyway, we're open the second week of March, March 10th through the last weekend of November. So we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5. Those are public walk-in hours. You don't need an appointment. People should come and hang out. We've got great tour guides in the museum, people who love their job and like love sharing this history. And we want to hear from people too. Like if you mentioned this, Jessica, but like if people listen to this, they're like, I have a story to share, like please don't be shy to reach out to us. And we often have opportunities where we've done like community archiving days before, where we set up in public libraries and people just bring their stuff and we digitize it. They get a copy, we get a copy, we get to preserve that story and put it in the archive. I think too often, if we don't sit down and tell these stories and pass them on, they will be told for us. Similar to like thinking about why do we think about redneck in the way that we do? It's because that story was told for us. It was told by people like Don Chafin, and it was very skewed. So I think, yeah, just if someone's listening to this and they're like, I wonder if my people were involved in the mine wars, maybe you should like sit down and start talking to your elders before they become your ancestors.
Amen to that. And if that pitch didn't convince you to go, Bernie Sanders himself got a tour of the Mountain Wars Museum not too long ago. Looked like he loved it.
Yeah, he did. That was wild. So he was coming into town to talk about oligarchy. What better place, to come than the Mine Wars Museum? And I'm so glad that that worked out. And I think every U.S. senator should tour the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum and know about this story and know that, Appalachians have a thing or two to teach the rest of the country of how to organize and how to build solidarity. So my hope is that we can get more people to come through. And yeah, we're very grateful for Senator Sanders for not only visiting the museum, he posted about it and like shared about it, which was a huge boost for us to get like national attention to the story. And I think like, as Appalachians, we can take for granted that we know about company script and we know about the company towns, but he didn't know about script. Like we're here to be a resource and to educate folks. And it was it was a fun time. And he was genuinely interested in what we had to offer. So
I hesitate to say broadly that Appalachia loves Bernie Sanders, but I do believe in my heart that it's true. We were talking about that Black Jewel strike in 2018, 2019, and I remember I had some friends down there, and they were like, "We're eating the Bernie pizza," and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they're like, Bernie ordered like 30 pizzas for the strikers and sent it to Harlan County.
amazing.
Yeah, I know. And yeah, so he's got a good reputation around here.
Yeah. And just like kudos to him for coming to Lenore. Most people that live in West Virginia probably couldn't point that out on a map to you where that's at without it being labeled. So I think anytime that we can get national attention to in our own voices. This was a town hall where we got to share, in our own voices what we thought was important. And I think any opportunity that we get to do that is we should take advantage of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for doing this. I am so excited to visit the museum. My husband actually was gonna come with me. For those listening, we were supposed to do this in person. We scheduled it 3 times. Weather, family emergencies, sickness, etc. Just kind of, maybe we shouldn't make plans in the winter. It truly is for hibernating.
Yeah.
So we weren't able to do it in person, but my husband was like gonna come with me, and he was super upset. He was like, "We have to go. We have to go."
Well, when y'all come, let me know so I can make sure to be there. I would love to give you the tour. I'll give you the Bernie Sanders tour.
Oh,
On
yes. You should
Wednesday.
put that on a menu. Like, if you donate this much to the Mine Wars Museum, you get the Bernie Sanders tour.
That's right. That's a good idea. That's like quality fundraising.
Thank you so much to Kenzie for coming on. Go visit the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. Ask for the Bernie Sanders tour. I know that's what I'm going to do when I go visit. Yeah, and if you have a connection to the Mine Wars, hit them up. What I really got from talking to Kenzie is that they are truly interested in making these connections and documenting this history. And could you all believe that the Mine Wars Museum was only 10 years old? Like, I was literally stunned when she told me that, because to me, as someone I live only 2 hours from the museum. I just thought it was always there. I was like, this is a legacy institution. But clearly that wasn't the case. But yeah, I am so excited to go visit, and I'm sure I will be sharing all the things on my social media when I do that. So if you want to follow me on those social medias, I have Instagram, and honestly, that's really the only one, in Substack. Those are the two that I'm really active on at this point. I have stepped a little bit away from the TikTok for reasons, and Blue Sky, I'm trying. There's not many of us over there, but I am trying. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, thank you to Kenny and Hayden Miles for my theme music, and Hayden Miles for the art for this episode and all episodes. I'll be back with a new episode before you know it.